You were a spectacle to them, a walking contradiction they could keep in the background, mention in jest, and forget when convenient. You were their entertainment, their safe punching bag. Not because you lacked strength, but because you hadn't shown it yet. And when power is dormant, the foolish believe it doesn't exist. That was their mistake. They failed to realize the most dangerous storm is the one that builds quietly beneath a calm sky. And you were a storm with a smirk, patient, observing, and lethal in timing. They only respected volume, flash, distraction, so your stillness irritated them. Your lack of reaction was their biggest threat, because people like that need chaos to validate their relevance. They thrive on drama, because without it, their identity crumbles. And since you didn't perform, didn't entertain, didn't beg, they reduced you to a caricature, something they could point at, but never understand. It wasn't that you weren't brilliant. It was that your brilliance wasn't packaged for their consumption. You weren't loud about your growth, so they called it stagnation. You weren't theatrical in your pain, so they assumed you didn't feel. But you did feel. Every joke, every dismissal, every slight dressed as sarcasm, and instead of snapping, you stored it, layer by layer, like venom in a vial. You became their punchline because they feared becoming your reflection. Your restraint was haunting. Your presence was uncomfortable. You reminded them of everything they abandoned to be accepted: depth, discernment, authenticity. So they ridiculed it, because ridicule is easier than reverence. And then the day came, not with thunder, but with clarity. The day your silence turned into strategy. The day you stopped asking to be seen and started choosing where you placed your gaze. They treated you like a joke, and you built an empire in the background. They weren't watching, but you were. And now, your existence is their echo. Every step you take is a slap they can't deflect. Every win, a reminder of how wrong they were. Your wake-up call wasn't a scream. It was a shift, a seismic one. The psychology of ridicule is rarely about you. It's a projection of their insecurity. Mockery is camouflage for fear. People laugh at what they don't understand because understanding demands introspection, and that's terrifying for the shallow. You threatened their illusion of superiority, so they tried to compress you into a box small enough to manage. And when you didn't fit, they blamed you. They shamed your complexity. They simplified your depth, because to honor you would mean confronting their own mediocrity. But here's what they never expected: that you'd embrace the outsider role and build from it, that you'd weaponize every dismissal, that you'd convert every "you're crazy" into a code for freedom. You didn't need to change for them to see your worth. You needed to change so they could no longer afford to ignore it. You didn't clap back. You didn't beg to be taken seriously. That's what made your wake-up call devastating, because it arrived without apology. You grew so far beyond their frame of reference, they couldn't even speak the language of your evolution. They mocked your ambitions until they became outcomes. They joked about your dreams until you outran their fantasies. And now they hide their jealousy behind passive admiration. They say, "I always knew you had potential," pretending they weren't the same ones who rolled their eyes when you were planting seeds. Let them pretend. Let them rewrite history. You don't need recognition from those who only see value once it shines. You needed the ridicule. It built your edge. It gave you something they'll never possess: substance born in solitude. They thought you were broken because you weren't performing. But broken people need applause. You needed time, and that time turned you into something they can't touch. You speak with conviction now, not to convince, but to declare. You move with certainty that unsettles them, because when you were quiet, they felt safe. When you laughed less, they felt superior. But your power now is not in your volume, it's in your indifference. Their opinion no longer registers. Their approval no longer costs. That is your victory. That is your revenge. Not rage, not retaliation. Just pure, unshakable autonomy. You no longer seek seats at tables that once mocked your presence. You build your own and lock the door behind you. They will ask for another chance, some in words, most in glances. They'll smile wider when they see you, hoping you've forgotten. But you haven't. You remember the chuckles, the way they downplayed your passion, the way they weaponized sarcasm and called it love. You won't rage. You'll nod. Maybe. But you won't re-engage, because your mind is no longer for rent, your energy no longer negotiable. And the tragedy? They'll never understand what they lost, because they never really knew what they had. They only valued what you gave when it was easy to laugh at. Now that it's untouchable, they'll dress their regret in nostalgia. Don't unpack that guilt. Let them carry it. You've carried enough. Every time they spoke your name like it was a punchline, they taught you something priceless, whose validation to never need again. You turned mockery into momentum. You turned sarcasm into sovereignty. You made their laughter irrelevant by outlasting their attention span. And now, you don't even flinch when they resurface. Because jokes don't echo in the minds of legends. You stopped playing small to keep their egos intact. You stopped shrinking your brilliance for the comfort of the blind. And the wake-up call wasn't just for them, it was for you. You realized no one would hand you reverence, so you became so undeniably powerful, they had to whisper it from a distance. Let them whisper. You are now the lesson they'll spend years decoding. Silence becomes a statement when your actions outgrow their imagination. They used to laugh when you went quiet. They thought your silence meant surrender, that your stillness was submission. But they didn't see the blueprint you were drawing in your head. They didn't hear the inner dialogue sharpening your resolve. While they celebrated their noise, you perfected your precision. You learned early that silence is not absence. It is energy being weaponized. And when they returned to mock the shell they thought they left behind, they found something else entirely. A structure, a presence, an empire born from restraint. Because you didn't stay silent out of fear. You stayed silent to prepare. They didn't realize your lack of reaction was not weakness. It was the birth of strategy. And by the time they saw it, your actions had already become too loud to ignore. They expected your comeback to be theatrical. They assumed you'd make a scene, throw words, demand apologies. That's how they would have handled it, through spectacle. But you moved like smoke, not fire. You disappeared from the drama and showed up in results. You changed the story without narrating it. You evolved in places their imagination never reached. And that's the thing about people who limit you. They only believe what they can measure. They don't have the depth to anticipate your growth. They only respect what they can control. So when you outgrew their concept of you, your silence turned poisonous to them. They couldn't predict your next move, couldn't locate your mind, couldn't trace your intentions. And in their confusion, they lost the power they thought they had. Your silence became a mirror they could no longer stare into. Because now, every action you take in absence of explanation reminds them of the disrespect they once dressed in sarcasm. You walk in rooms without a word, and they flinch. Not because you've threatened them, but because your presence no longer seeks recognition. You have nothing to prove. And that kind of autonomy, the kind that isn't performative, is the most violent declaration. You don't beg, you don't justify, you build. And in every brick laid in silence, they hear the screams of what they missed. They see the future you've built without their hand. And no apology can survive in the shadow of a masterpiece they once mocked. People like them were trained to respond to noise, to chaos. They were raised in environments where the loudest pain got the most attention. So when you stopped explaining, they assumed they'd won. But silence doesn't mean surrender. It means detachment. It means the dialogue is over and the decision has been made. And when you act with that level of calm, when you move without need for permission or applause, you become myth. You become legend. Because they can't map what they can't hear. They can't disarm what doesn't announce itself. You became dangerous the moment you stopped trying to be understood and started crafting a world that no longer required their comprehension. And that world, they don't belong in it. They're not equipped for its altitude. Silence can suffocate the unprepared. When your growth no longer seeks an audience, it becomes a threat to those who live for validation. You were once that person too, needing the nod, the hand on the shoulder, the kind word after the storm. But something in you shifted. Maybe it was betrayal. Maybe it was boredom. Maybe it was the realization that their praise always came with chains. So you vanished, not from the world, but from their reach. And while they waited for your return, to the pedestal, the role, the dance, you rewired your very fabric. You became someone they would no longer recognize even if you sat across from them. Because your silence wasn't just quiet, it was alchemy. You stopped feeding the cycle, stopped responding to every comment, every dig, every attempt to pull you back into the orbit of their doubt. And in doing so, you collapsed their reality. They needed you to need them. They thrived on your attempts to explain, to fix, to stay. But silence gave them none of that. It gave them emptiness. And people who depend on control can't breathe in emptiness. They drown in it. They reach out, hoping for the old version of you to respond. But you're not there. You're already light years beyond. And every message they send, every glance they hope catches yours, is just another sign that their influence no longer echoes in the halls of your mind. You became untouchable not by hiding, but by healing. And healed people are terrifying to those who only knew how to relate through pain. You stopped bleeding for them. You stopped performing wounds just to make them feel relevant. And now that your silence holds no entry point, they spiral. Because what they mistook for weakness was preparation. What they mocked as withdrawal was rebirth. And now that you speak only through outcome, through aura, through momentum, they stutter. They don't know how to approach someone who doesn't flinch, doesn't fight, doesn't fold. They treated you like a story they could rewrite. But you became a language they were never fluent in, a dialect only spoken in results. You are no longer trying to be seen. You are building without visibility. And in that invisibility, your influence multiplies. Because real power moves in silence. It does not need echo chambers. It does not feed on performance. It simply is. You are. And that being is a blade. Sharp. Still. Waiting. Not for validation, but for purpose. You aren't here to convince anyone you've changed. You're here to live in a way that makes their memory of you obsolete. They will speak of who you were. They will try to summon your ghost. But ghosts don't speak. They haunt. And you, without a word, have become the haunting. The turning point isn't revenge. It's the moment you no longer explain who you are. They don't deserve the version of you that narrates their own awakening. They don't deserve a guided tour of your identity, your pain, your choices. You've spent years handing out blueprints to people who only wanted to redesign you. Every explanation was a negotiation. Every moment you opened your mouth to clarify, to justify, to soften the blow of your becoming, it cost you a piece of your spine. And they loved it. Loved watching you unravel yourself for their understanding. Because understanding gave them leverage. It gave them a seat at the table of your mind. But the turning point, that beautiful fracture in the pattern, it came when you realized they were never listening to understand. They were listening to categorize, to control, and that's when you stopped. Mid-sentence, mid-story. You looked around, saw the futility, and chose silence. You used to believe being understood was a form of love, that if you just said it right, explained it clearly, they would see you, truly see you. But you were never being seen. You were being managed. Your pain was being compared, your ideas measured against their comfort zones. You were too much, too intense, too fast, too raw. So you simplified yourself, diluted your fire, translated your chaos into calm just to stay digestible. And still, they didn't get it. Because it was never about clarity. It was about containment. You could have painted your soul in the sky, and they would have asked why it wasn't written in their language. That's why the real rebellion wasn't shouting. It was withdrawal. The day you stopped explaining was the day you stopped bleeding for their approval. They don't know how to handle the version of you that speaks in boundaries instead of backstories. They're terrified of the you that responds with, "I don't owe you context." Because context used to be your leash. You gave them every chapter, every nuance, every tender memory. You gave them the why behind the what, the how behind the hurt. And in return, they offered you misinterpretation dressed as dialogue. Now they stand confused, wondering where the script went. But the new version of you doesn't carry a script, doesn't pause to translate. It just moves. You've become a language that doesn't beg to be learned. You don't convince anyone anymore. You just exist. And that existence, firm, unapologetic, is far more unnerving than any vengeance could ever be. They thought they broke you when you went quiet. But quiet isn't collapse. It's calculation. The old you would have argued, would have cried, would have written essays trying to bridge the gap. The new you builds bridges only for those who know how to walk across without trying to burn them. You no longer seek closure. You don't chase comprehension. Because you've realized people hear only what their ego allows. And you will no longer water down your essence to make it palatable. If they don't get you, they don't get access. It's that simple now. That brutal. And in that brutality, you find a calm sharper than any blade. You walk differently now. Not faster, but heavier. Every step says, I no longer need you to understand me, to validate me. When they tell the story of you, they'll sound confused. One day, they just stopped explaining. Yes, that's the day you chose your own voice over their interpretation. You are not here to be palatable. You are not a product for mass consumption. You are an experience. And experiences are not explained. They are felt. The turning point wasn't when you got revenge. It was when you realized revenge was too small, too reactive. It still centered them. You chose something far more potent. You centered yourself. You no longer care if they label you bitter or cold. Let them. That's their way of coping with your boundary. Their words don't land anymore because your identity no longer depends on their language. You see the world differently now. You walk through it like someone who knows that being misunderstood is part of being great. Let them misread you. Let them get it wrong. You no longer correct them. because correcting them assumes their understanding holds weight, and it doesn't. Your clarity doesn't need an audience. You wake up clean, free, untethered from the need to explain why you are the way you are. Your past was not a puzzle for them to solve. Your transformation is not a thesis for them to critique. Your silence now? It's sacred. A rebellion that costs them more than any spoken retaliation ever could. Because now, they're talking to a wall that used to open up like a cathedral. They'll fish for cracks, test your edges, say things just to provoke a reaction they once knew how to summon. But the silence now isn't passive. It's protective. It is the fortress built from every wasted word you gave them in good faith. And it is bulletproof. You no longer let them climb the walls of your thoughts. They will call you distant, selfish, even cruel. But the real cruelty was what they did with your vulnerability when you were still trying to be understood. They mistook your openness for obligation. They mistook your empathy for weakness. And now that you've reclaimed the right to remain silent, they have nothing left but the echo of their own confusion. You are no longer narrating your worth. You embody it. That's what terrifies them. You no longer perform your growth. You live it. Quietly. Consistently. Unapologetically. Your identity no longer comes with a disclaimer. You've walked into a chapter where being misunderstood is not a problem. It's a filter. It weeds out those who can't meet you where you are. And you are so far above the noise now that even your shadow intimidates. They miss the old you, the one who would have tried to explain the elevation. But the air is thinner up here, and you don't carry oxygen masks for tourists anymore. So this is the true shift. Not revenge, not rage, but freedom. Freedom from the need to be known by those who only valued you when you were explainable. You are not a math problem. You are not a translation. You are not here to be decoded. You are art. And art doesn't explain itself. It just exists. Bold, brazen, unbothered. The turning point came the moment you chose to stop being legible to those who never wanted to read past the cover. And in that moment, you became untouchable. Let them wonder. Let them guess. Let them spin stories around your silence. Because the truth, it lives in your walk now, and you've stopped walking in circles. They were never afraid of your words. They were afraid of the day you would stop speaking. The day you would no longer seek their approval. That day has come. You are the silence they never prepared for. You are the outcome their imagination couldn't fathom. And now, your absence speaks. Your movement echoes. And your silence, the same silence they laughed at, has become the most deafening sound they've ever heard. Let it ring. Let it echo. Let it be the reminder that while they were busy underestimating, you were busy becoming untouchable.